A small, quiet, and fun college town was horrifically betrayed in the dead of night during November 2022, where 4 students were found lying in their own blood, lifeless, and 4 families will never feel safe again, but instead be left with haunting memories, while these innocent victims, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee conclaves, and Madison mogen, were vigorously murdered in the late-night hours through a night out. The locals of the area had once felt comfortable enough to wander the streets throughout these neighborhoods. This was an area where you could go meet your friends for a coffee, or go to a local restaurant, maybe even a bar in the downtown area. A town small enough where joining a sorority or a fraternity would put you in a frame of popularity across the entire school board. But instead, now in the town of Moscow, Idaho, this had turned into these serial killing hunting grounds for these 4 innocent and young students. They really could be considered just kids, because none of them had even made it through undergrad just yet. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old and a freshman at the University of Idaho. He was also in the Sigma Chi fraternity, majoring in sports, tourism, and recreational management. He was even a triplet to his brother and sister, Macy and Hunter, raised by his parents Jim and Stacy in Conway, Washington, and the 3 of them had just enrolled that prior year in August of 2021, and he was especially close with his brother Hunter, being known as his wingman. Xana had actually also become pretty good friends with both Kaylee and Madison as they were going to school together, and they were now roommates living near the campus. Kaylee was actually 21 years old though, and in the Alpha Phi sorority, majoring in general studies, and she was known from her sister to have everything going for her. Absolutely everything. She even had her job lined up, and she worked really hard for it. Much like Kaylee was a senior, Madison was also a senior, 21 years old, and in the Pi Beta Phi sorority with Xana, majoring in marketing. She and Kaylee actually grew up together in northern Idaho. They were very good best friends, and they were even known to perform spot-on impressions of one another.
It's 8. Gotta go. Jake's calling. Oh, Jake's calling.
As much as Kaylee and Madison were as best friends, they even go as far back as 6th grade, where Madison grew up in a city called Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, and not too far from that, Kaylee was from Rathdrum. Now, they did everything together. They went to the same high school together, Lake City High. They did homework together, shared everything, even applied to the same colleges and ended up at the University of Idaho. They even worked at the same restaurant, Mad Greek, in downtown Moscow. Now they were young adults pursuing better things in life, and coming together in this close-knit community in Moscow and attending college together, their lives were just beginning to pick up, and it showed through everything they did. There's even some statements of things that people said in loving ways that I will talk about later on in this Crime Entries episode. Much like myself, or like you if you were or are in college, or really anyone that has ever had the chance to go and enjoy some time with your friends, well, that's what these young men and women had done over a weekend. It was a Saturday, November 12th, 2022, when Kaylee and Madison had wanted to commemorate themselves and probably celebrate that they were now seniors and almost graduating college, so they ended up going to the Corner Club bar in downtown Moscow. Meanwhile, Ethan and Xana had taken a different route for their plans and ended up going to a fraternity house party at the Sigma Chi house. Now, the night for all 4 of them would really go on quite late, but this is kind of the norm, the usual for college students, right? Some of them are staying out in the whole night. Now, Kaylee and Madison would end up staying at the Corner Club bar until around 10 or 11 p.m., and throughout the night they kept it going a bit. They were enjoying themselves, and they would finally find themselves at the Grub Truck, which is a local food truck in the area, and this was about 1:40, almost 2 a.m. in the morning. Now, for me, this is insane. At this point in my life, I'm probably going to bed at like 9 or 10 at the latest, but these girls were really enjoying themselves, and I'm pretty sure they worked up an appetite, and they were ready for that grub.
Hello!
Hi!
Welcome back!
Thanks. I think I would like the carbonara.
As documented in this crime case, the girls were out really late, and it was already into the next weekend day of that early Sunday morning. They were going to make their way home after the grub truck, and they had called an Uber at first, but this was later changed in evidence as a private individual, so perhaps it was someone that they didn't have to pay for a ride-home service. They ended up getting home at 1:45 a.m., but throughout this time, they were caught on some surveillance footage walking down the street. But they weren't alone. They weren't walking to some individual to give them a ride home. The person was already with them. Was this person suspicious? Could they have been in danger? Through the investigations of this surveillance footage, there's to be seen 3 individuals. And one of them is a man walking alongside in the middle of the night on the sidewalk with these two girls. Who Adam even is a mystery throughout all of this and why he was even there. They later found out that Adam was a bartender at the corner club. But what would Adam be doing with these two girls in the middle of the night walking alone with them? Was he their friend? Was he intentionally doing this out of some spite or putting them in danger? Or was he going to be their ride home? Well, detectives eventually stated that they never really considered this Adam the bartender any kind of suspect throughout this investigation, and the four of these people ended up getting home safely. Well, Ethan and Xana got back home a bit later at around 2 a.m. or just after, and they all actually had decided at this rental house that they were all staying in. Ethan was a boyfriend, so he was staying the night. They continued the party, and while it lasted a couple of hours throughout the night, neighbors in the nearby area had actually reported to hear sounds of the party going on.
Approach.
We can hear you from clear down the road when we were coming up here. We could hear the music,
Okay.
and that's...
I'm so sorry.
Now, throughout the impending next hours, this was also a part of the puzzle of the dark, twisted, grim, and morbid nature.
Any outside music, any loud yelling needs to be done.
Okay.
Because we're not... Next time, you're getting a ticket.
That would end up being the scene for all of these poor kids in the house. It was already about 4 a.m., and Xana would actually get a DoorDash order for her own food. So nothing was really signaling to these students that they were in any immediate danger. However, it was around 4:30, Xana had gotten her food, and there was actually a security camera in the house, about 50 feet away from Xana's room, where there was to be heard some whimpering and a thud by detectives. Now, this was stated by her roommate, who was actually listening to this going on, heard the thud, heard some whimpering, but thought that it was just Xana playing with her dog at the time. But, to the unfortunate matter, this was leading up to the moments that maybe this thud, maybe this whimpering, wasn't necessarily just an innocent college girl playing with her dog. Maybe they would have begged the question, did someone fall? Are they okay? But they didn't pay any mind to it just yet. Now, other than that thud, they had also thought they heard Kaylee say, "Wait, there's someone here." Now, this is pretty creepy, I think. At least, wouldn't it ring some alarms in the back of your head saying, who the hell is that someone? And if they're not Ethan or another roommate, then why is it just so casual that Kaylee would say this? Now, this roommate did have this feeling, and so she went to go check. She went to go creep out from her bedroom and peek to see if there was someone there, if Kaylee was actually talking to anyone that was not supposed to be there. And at first, upon first glance, she really didn't notice anyone. And so she went back into her room, just going throughout the next few minutes. But I do think that this roommate's instincts might have kicked in after that. Not only did they not see anybody, but maybe they thought to themselves, something doesn't really feel right. And so they did end up checking again. They would peek their head out of their door once again to see what was going on. Because they didn't end up seeing just anybody, but they did see someone that was not Ethan, was not Kaylee. It was actually a dark figure that was about 6 foot tall, and this figure was wearing black clothing and a mask. Now, in this moment, I would be super scared. I wouldn't even know what to do. You can't really scream or anything, and so this roommate just watched as this figure was roaming through the hallway, wearing this mask like they were freshly done trick-or-treating, and it was said to be a man with some bushy eyebrows and not so much so as muscular, but athletically built. And so if you're a girl in the middle of the night and there's a man with a mask, why would anybody want to interfere with that situation? But people might have been in danger. Meanwhile, this roommate that had seen this figure really didn't do anything to question why a random person dressed like this was in the house. They really didn't want to engage, and so they pretty much just went back into their room, trying to act as natural as possible upon this creepy sighting, locked their door behind them, and pretty much waited until the next morning. These hours had passed. It was pretty much sun up anyway at dawn, and these roommates would come together, and not only would they find that this intruder was no longer in the house, but they'd also found that somebody was unconscious. And so they had ended up not just immediately trying to help this person, but instead resorting to calling a couple of friends over to this house so that maybe they could help. Maybe as a group, they could help their mutual friend regain their consciousness, wake up, because something was wrong. I mean, were these kids doing drugs? Did they take something, or were they drunk and just were passed out and needed extra help? Well, they ended up calling 911 and reporting an unconscious person. Now, being that there was an intruder, now an unconscious person. So during the 911 call, this roommate that was reporting what they had seen, this dark figure, basically 6 foot, just describing his eyebrows, his build, the way that he looked with the mask, they had also called at around 12 the next day. So multiple hours had passed. Maybe everyone fell asleep, and now they were just trying to regain what they had seen, and they were trying to get their bearings on the situation. They were reporting this, but the roommate on the phone to 911 ended up saying that once they saw this figure, the reason they didn't do anything was because they were scared, frozen, and in shock, not knowing how to handle the situation. Especially in such a gigantic house like this one, where there's a ton of different areas and rooms for things to go wrong, while an intruder might have even broken in the middle of the night. I mean, this was a type of house that had 3 different floors, 6 bedrooms, and 3 different bathrooms. 1 bathroom on each floor and 2 different bedrooms on each floor. There was also 2 different sliding glass doors, and there was one on the second floor that was reachable from about the ground level outside, and another one that was only reachable on the 3rd floor from a balcony of one of the bedrooms. Now it makes me wonder, like, were none of these entryways locked? 2 sliding glass doors, an intruder could have easily just slid one open if one of these kids hadn't made sure that the house was secure, maybe even a window. There was 3 different levels, so about how many options did this intruder get in through, and why was it so easy for someone to just sneak in with nobody to notice? Now, this roommate that was reporting all of this to the cops did end up also explaining that they did see this intruder start to go out through the back entryway of the sliding glass door, which I'm assuming wasn't locked, and so this intruder pretty much just made their way in. Now, after 911, the officers actually did make it to the scene, and they were about to unveil just the horrendous scene and the aftermath that was left after this night, which this roommate wouldn't have been involved in, as they were just pretty much minding their own business in their own room. They ended up safe. But as far as everybody else in the house, well, according to the police reports, the first responders of police that made it to the crime scene actually ended up finding all 4 students, Xana, Kaylee, Madison, and Ethan, all stabbed to death. All 4 victims were found on either the 2nd or 3rd floors of this house, and it's just probably the most depressing, morbid, and saddening crime scene that you can view, as anybody might have to see this. These students were not even getting their lives started. All of it ripped from under them, their bodies ripped to shreds, with all of these stab wounds across their bodies. Now, considering that there were a total of 6 people on this lease, and only 4 of them were found stabbed to death that night, while the Moscow Police Department had actually determined upon arriving at the scene that perhaps the other 2 people that made it through the night weren't even home at the time that it was happening. They were living on the ground floor in that moment and during that time, so perhaps they had made it after the fact and fell asleep throughout the rest of the morning, and now they were with their own roommates. These roommates named Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk. Well, this killer, this murderer that took out 4 students in one night, just happened to scurry past the ground level of his house. And not to say that these 2 students deserved the same results of this aftermath, but I mean, they were pretty lucky that this killer didn't even check, or they weren't even there at the time. How much more luck can you have to make it away from a group mass murder like this? During the initial moments of the beginning of the crime scene investigations, police had determined that these kids were all murdered probably between the hours of 4 and 4:30 in the morning, which pretty much does line up. It is consistent with when this roommate that was on the phone, hearing this thud, hearing Kaylee possibly saying there's somebody in the house. It all adds up to around that time frame. But while they were scanning the house, the police department were scanning each floor, the bedrooms, the bathrooms, the entryways. They never found a forced point of entry. So it makes me wonder, I mean, what do you all think? Did this intruder pretty much just happen to casually walk on into this house with no difficulty whatsoever, just ever so casually, like he lived there? After the initial first few searches of the crime scene investigation for the police department, just to kind of uncover the aftermath of what might have happened, well, the Moscow Police Chief, James Fry, did make some statements to the community as a form of perhaps some reassurance. However, I'm not sure how reassuring it might have been in the end, because they said pretty much, well, yes, we found these 4 students. They were all stabbed to death from what it looks like, but we have no murder weapon. Nothing that was used in the killings of these students has been found yet. But over the weekend, the entire community, the news, reporters, everybody could see how the investigators, the examiners, the police department were flooding in and out of this house, carrying a bunch of evidence markers and a bunch of other things like pictures and other data points of evidence about this crime scene. So it was really a big mystery at this point. Nobody knew what was going on besides these 4 students were found. I can only imagine just how much work it was to uncover this crime scene, because this was a big house. There were a few different students, 4 different bodies. I mean, there were 3,000 tips about what had happened this night, and 4,000 crime scene photos that were taken along with the evidence markers that the investigators were placing on this scene. This is just the most morbid and horrid example of a situation throughout a community like this, where it's just a small town of about 26,000. I mean, these people were terrified. They really had nothing to go off of because the police department said, we don't have a suspect. There's someone still at large throughout this whole thing, and these people were afraid to go to sleep during the nights now. Alright everyone, before we get into the deep end of this true crime case, if you believe that these 4 victims deserve to get justice for what happened to them, in the next 5 seconds, deep dive into that subscribe button so you never miss a Crime Entries episode. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Did you do it? Yeah? Okay, let's get on with this story. One of the things that were confusing about the police statements initially was that even though they didn't find a suspect, but just the bodies initially, they did say that they were looking into the live stream footage of the Twitch stream from the food truck, the grub truck. Now, this footage was supposed to be helpful for them in their investigation. It really just more so sounds like they wanted something to give the community as sort of like, yeah, we're doing our jobs, just let us be. But I mean, Dylan and Bethany were also out, and they weren't the ones in this food truck area. They were just doing their own thing, and it begs the question of why were they the only ones to survive? If they had gotten there even after the fact that all of these murders happened, I mean, they could have sensed something was up. It just doesn't make sense in that matter because, well, did they even let the intruder in? Did they have it out for their roommates? Could that be an option? They were the only ones that made it out alive, and this food truck footage really didn't seem to have any sort of additional value into the matter. There was also further statements made by other officials around the area, like with the school and even the mayor, that were recognizing the students, and Scott Green, the president of the school, actually came out to say that there was really no amount of depth and sadness or depression that brought on upon the light that these students had brought into the world, that it was just such a morbid situation. And, well, Art Bej, the mayor, he actually said that people have to stay vigilant, and it was just a very saddening situation for him what happened on November 13th, that he can't even think about describing this because of how depressing and tragic it was for everybody involved, and they were going to do everything that they could to solve this crime. Not only were they going to do everything to solve this crime, but they didn't really have any answers available, which is what the mayor had stated along with the other things, and, well, he was right, because there was also other people alongside the families that were pretty frustrated from the lack of empathy and clarity that the police department was giving throughout this entire situation. There are people like the parents of mothers and fathers that came out sort of against the police department in their frustrations, their irritation for not releasing more information across the board.
I know the girls reached out via texting and calling, so I can only assume that by the phones being ignored, knowing how my daughter is not going to ignore calls and texts.
There were some interviews that took place about Kaylee and in terms of how they felt towards the police officers, with her mother especially saying that she felt like they were just kind of skimming across every suspect and dismissing a lot of different names that could be potential murderers and suspects in the situation that had it out against Kaylee. She may even have had a stalker. Now, Dylan and Bethany made it out of this alive. Although they weren't being pursued as suspects, they could have potentially had some part of the situation, or maybe make it easier for the suspect to get into the house of any manner. And in general, the family was incredibly frustrated. Not even Kaylee's family, but other families as well, especially with Ethan and his father, Jim Chapin. He was really speaking poorly about the police department, saying that their statements, their vague way of talking about the situation, was feeling false innuendos and really confusing everyone involved, that the police should really come out, say the truth, state what's really happening. That way it doesn't really make the agony more unbearable for the families involved that are trying to grieve throughout the situation. And I don't blame him, because the police had the audacity to really just describe this as an edged weapon that was used in the entire situation. They were really lacking any clarity whatsoever throughout most of this story, and it frustrates even me, and they're not even my family. I mean, how could a police department be so vague through such a gruesome crime scene. Now, at this point, the students had been taken to the Latah County coroner, Kathy Mabat, who was pretty much examining what had happened, and she actually came out to say that it seemed personal. Whoever did this had it out to get these students in this very specific manner, and they were targeted. And it was with a large blade, so she further supported the police, saying that it was some sort of edged weapon. But she had also said that it was a bunch of stab wounds across their bodies, and specifically each of them had abdomen within their torso area and chest wounds. Now, this area hadn't had a murder crime since 2015. It's been a long time, and these people were really taken off guard. The part that really frustrated me and made me pretty angry about the police is that Kedrick Wills, who was with the Idaho State County, he pretty much had the audacity to say, well, crime has no bounds. There was no way to understand the abstract way that this took place, and that is just deepening the saddening for everybody involved, for the school, the state, the city of Moscow. It was really just a generalized way of talking about how this happened. Knowing that it was personal and targeted at this point, crime has no bounds, really. And, well, Olivia, who is a sister of Kaylee, actually said that it was not 1, 2, 3, it was 4 victims that were targeted.
We had zero details. We just knew they were gone. The rideshare driver said around 1:45, Kaylee had texted him requesting a ride from the Grub truck, which is the local mac and cheese food truck, to take her back home to 1122 King, and she had with her another female. So I was able to look it up and find Kaylee on the video, and I saw the girl that she was with was Maddie. So at that point I knew Kaylee and Maddie were together. They got into the car to go home together and alone. I immediately took it to the police officers. Here's her phone information. Here's the rideshare driver's name.
I mean, this was pretty much a serial killing moment, and the police were just not really even caring about anything. So finally, the police were now following up on foot to look for this large knife that could have been used as a murder weapon in the stabbings of these students. They had stated to be looking for a Rambo-style knife, some gigantic Ka-Bar brand that is used to probably kill big bears, deer, who knows, but something that's probably difficult to conceal if you're going to murder students. It doesn't really make sense, and what also doesn't make sense is that they didn't even sell this at the local hardware store that these police detectives went to go search for it at. But it doesn't add up, because couldn't they have just done a simple Google search to figure out that it wasn't even in stock? I mean, this is just kind of common sense, and the lack of clarity further on. This police department really didn't have anything together. So what they didn't find was the Rambo-style knife upon looking at this hardware store, but what they did release in evidence going forward was an actual shoe print. A shoe print that was supposed to be from the suspect and maybe pointing in a direction or showing a shoe size of who this person could be that would further help them identify anybody involved that committed this crime. Kathy Mabat had actually said that this was seemingly a pretty angry person, pretty aggressive towards these people, probably knew them on some sort of level, and that was going to help them further identify anybody that may have had this potential motive. Olivia, her sister, Kaylee's sister, had actually also said that the police say that this is isolated, they say that they have it under control, but nobody's in custody yet. They haven't arrested anybody, and so she spoke out to her community saying, protect each other. We have to look out for this person, because until the police have someone in custody, we can't believe really anything that they say. Consider Kaylee a sister. She was a sister to everyone in this town, and we have to treat the situation as such and defend ourselves from any potential future threats. And after the 4 bodies' autopsies were finished, the police ended up actually pursuing more surveillance footage around the area. And this surveillance footage wasn't just people walking down the street. This was a more specified part right near the house, where they had actually found that there was a white Hyundai Elantra that was driving 2 or 3 times, and maybe even a 4th time around 4 a.m. that was around the house. And so now they had reported this, talked amongst themselves throughout the police department, and stating, hey, we need to keep an eye out for this specific white Elantra car that's driving around the area. And, well, what do you know? Going forward the next few days, they ended up spotting one of these Elantras, the white car, along some traffic stops. Along 2 traffic stops, actually, 2 different mistakes that this person had made while just casually driving, and now they may have found the exact suspect the exact Elantra that they had seen in this nearby the house surveillance footage. So these traffic stops actually happened twice on December 15th of 2022, once by the Hancock County Police Department and once by Indiana State Police. The first time was for speeding, the second time was for following behind a car too closely. The person identified was a man named Bryan kohberger. He was actually with his father at the time. While Bryan was in the driver's seat, his father was in the passenger seat both times, and they were actually going east of Indianapolis for an apparent pre-planned trip, probably for the holidays. Now, he was actually being questioned at this point, and they figured out that perhaps he had more to be involved in this as being the identifying car, and now he wasn't really adding up with his stories, and they actually found out that he was a student in Washington. He was actually a PhD student in college at the same time as these other students were.
You got stopped by a trooper? We don't have any SUVs. It was a county guy. Was it like a black SUV? Okay, all right. You saw you guys were following too closely? I'm not going to give you guys another ticket or warning if you just got stopped. Just make sure you give yourself plenty of room, okay? So like I said, it's all about how fast you're going, okay? So if you're going 10 miles an hour, you only need one car. Or if you're going, so the speed limit here is 7. If you're going 70 miles an hour, you need 7 cars. Yeah. That's the easy way to explain it. Right? Yeah. Okay. It's really, if you're in a B&B man, it says 227.
Through the Indiana State Police traffic stop, they had actually determined that maybe this car was connected to a tracing dated back on November 29th, where they had found out that this car was also near the area of the 13th, where the murders took place, in Pullman, Washington, where he had been living and going to college. Now, Bryan was finishing out his December semester, and then he and his father were going to take a road trip to his Pennsylvania home, where his father was living at the time, so he was kind of driving from state to state, but it was a bit fishy now that this car was connected to the entire investigation, and police were about to figure out and uncover a whole lot more in connections. This Indiana State Police traffic stop had actually gone all the way back to Washington, where they were communicating with officers there, and one of the officers had actually traced Bryan's phone records and found out that he was indeed in Washington, and they found his exact match of a car. Not only that, but they had also found that he was in the area of the house in Idaho where these murders were taking place that night. He was in the area at around 9 to 9:30 in the morning, and even before that, dating all the way back to August, a couple of months prior to this even happening, he was there a total of 12 times. And pretty much all of those times, except for one that they found in his phone records, he was there around the area at late at night or early in the morning. Why would he have to be in that area in this random part of Idaho so many times? Was this the exact stalker that Kaylee's mother had complained about to the police? The same stalker that they had pretty much dismissed and not pursued throughout the entire evidence and investigation of these murders? I mean, they pretty much ignored this, and the guy was there multiple times. Was he scouting the house? Scouting the students? Now, this Bryan kohberger was actually a 28-year-old criminology student that was studying for his PhD at Washington State University. But Washington State University was pretty much only 10 miles of a distance from the University of Idaho, and so it was definitely logical and practical that he could have been driving back and forth throughout this duration in the white Elantra. Now, especially with these phone records, they'd found that he had actually turned his phone off that night from around 2 to 4 or 5 a.m., which was an exact match of when the murders took place in the first place. And so now he was a prime suspect. Now they had really began to unfold exactly his whereabouts and the person in the area. Now they'd finally gotten their act together as a police department, and they were going to track this guy's whereabouts going forward, because it doesn't end there. He was there. Now they had to figure out exactly what else had happened with him in that night. Along with tracking his phone and realizing that he was around the same time frame and area as the 2022 murders, well, they'd also understood that he was also quite the sophisticated student as Ethan, Xana, Madison, and Kaylee were. Now that he was pursuing his PhD, he had actually applied for an internship in 2022, stating to the Pullman police that he wanted to help them better understand and collect analyzing data to better help rule crime areas. And if that's not manipulative for the way that he depicted himself, I don't know what is. I mean, someone that can play two different parts and basically put on two different masks, acting as a sophisticated person that's doing well in school, and also apply for an internship for the Pullman police. And not only that, but he also put out a Reddit post that was kind of a survey asking people what they thought about the psychological and emotional traits that it would take to commit a crime. Now, what do you all think? Because this really seems to me like almost a direct foreshadowing. Had he been the direct suspect, and as he goes on to maybe prove his case or maybe not, someone like this is super manipulative and able to act a certain way and portray a completely different person that nobody had known about until it was too late. And in addition to finding that Reddit post and also the internship, he was trying to make this seem like he was just a person moving on with his life and doing as an adult should. As far as November 18th goes, which is only 5 days after the murder took place, he had actually newly registered and got a new license plate in Washington State for his Hyundai Elantra, the white one that the police were looking for. And so, being that he changed out everything as far as information goes, it was almost like he was trying to, cover his tracks, hide the way that they could find him by typing in a certain number of a license plate and it coming up as a completely different one. Not only that, but that blade that they were looking for, the giant Rambo knife that they were looking through garbage and checking a local hardware store that didn't even carry it, well, they ended up finding a leather sheath. A leather sheath that was on Madison's bed in her bedroom that had some blood DNA evidence on it. This DNA evidence that directly linked to Bryan's dad. At this point, there was really no going back from that. I mean, it has his dad's DNA on it. It's not Bryan's, but what's it doing in the crime scene evidence directly on a bed where one of these people got stabbed to death? And so after the matter, they actually went to Bryan's dad's home and ended up finding a little bit more that would tie everything together as far as where Bryan was and what he'd used. They were going to find out it was a lot darker than they had thought initially. Now, it is Bryan's dad's, so he was probably stealing it from his dad, using it in order to further pursue the crime scene that night, even if it wasn't his directly. And upon that initial finding of the knife sheath, they actually ended up further searching through Bryan's dad's home in Pennsylvania near the Pocono Mountains, and what they'd find was completely morbid. They actually had to take the SWAT team there and arrest him on the spot pretty much. And he was arrested on 4 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary. Now the reason is because they had found some face masks, a .40 caliber Glock 22, some empty magazines, and a knife. So this was pretty much the beginning of Bryan's end throughout the justice system. Now, while they were taking him into custody, Kaylee's mom had actually maybe not even known this guy. She said that they didn't recognize him, but they may be able to tie some things together that she really didn't want to talk about. It wasn't even something that she considered to bring up. Maybe she didn't want to paint Kaylee, her daughter, in a bad light, but they did see a connection between them.
It's definitely a little scary, and it's spooky to think about someone in the community being here for years and just having no idea.
Now, what I thought was just quite insensitive on Bryan's attorneys and defense counsel at the time when he appeared in court in Pennsylvania on January 4th, 2023, is that they had actually said that he was just out for a late night drive on that night, where he had sometimes gone for a hike or a walk just to see the moon and the stars. As if they can paint something so light and be so contradictory to the way that this evidence was playing out. People literally got murdered and they're saying that this guy was just out to stargaze. But he was further on charged with those murder charges, the burglary, and he was waiting to be extradited in Idaho.
Mr. Kohberger is in custody. He is appearing here in court with his attorneys, Ms. Taylor, Mr. Logston. Mr. Thompson, Ms. Jennings appearing on behalf of the state.
Mr. Kohberger understands his right to a timely preliminary hearing, and he's willing to waive the timeliness to allow us time to obtain discovery in this case and be prepared.
What was really shady, though, and just painted a better picture for how he manipulated everyone involved, is it was pretty obvious, and as his prosecutor, I would probably have brought this up, because when he was in court, Bryan had actually a few cuts on his face. Near his jawline, a 2-inch cut somewhere around his cheek area and his chin, and, well, these might even be defensive wounds. These kids were probably trying to fight back, and he cut himself or got scratched in the process. But this wasn't anything they even considered. Nonetheless, during his court hearing, he was proceeded to be processed without bail in the Latah County Jail in Idaho, and his parents and sisters were actually all there watching this happen. and he had the audacity as he was passing by them to just say in a low tone, "I love you." Now, this is all they really had to go off of at this point. He really had nowhere else to go. Everything was against him, and he had the strength to give his parents a few last words that they'd see from him. Now, it was only just this past month in December of 2024 where all of this would happen in court, and Judge John C., who was actually handling this entire case, had actually said that maybe there was too much misinformation and just wrongful statements going throughout all of the lawyers, all of the reportings. Everything about this case was just getting in the way of Bryan getting his fair trial, as the law would state. Now they were worried that, maybe things will be too much against him, too much bias going on. So now they were thinking, we can't even stay in Moscow. We can't even have this court hearing here. We're going to have to move him someplace else. And maybe even he'll get another judge that will handle this entire case. And this definitely didn't go well with the families that were dealing with this entire situation. There was too much back and forth throughout all of the officials. Starting with the cops. And now he can't even go through a straightforward process in the courts where the families can watch him and not have to travel long durations just to see this guy get justice for what he'd done. This is going to continue until next year, 2025. That's when he's actually going to get his verdict to his initial sentencing for the court. And it's supposed to last about 3 months. So not only are these families going to have to wait from the 2 years that they already have, but they're going to have to wait until a third year just to get any sort of information about this. It seems like they've just been given the whole runaround throughout everything. Now, there was a lot of grief, sadness, and tragedy, a lot of back and forth as well between a bunch of different families, especially with the initial troubles between the law enforcement. None of that should have ever have had to have happened, and people should have taken this more seriously. But a year after everything, in 2023 of November, they did end up having a vigil at the University of Idaho, and Tanner McLean, who is the student president of Associated Students, was giving a speech saying that these students, the entire community of the university, really needed to start grieving and start absorbing all of this process, and it was now a good time to acknowledge the loss. So they brought on a couple of more people to have statements and just let out their heartfelt feelings. Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen actually came out in a few of their written statements that they had the youth pastor say in this entire vigil to the community of students that were grieving. And Dylan had actually said that, I know somewhere out there, Xana and Ethan are together. They are together and they are in a better place, thinking about us, looking down at us, knowing that they're together, so they're going to be okay. And as far as Kaylee and Madison, the duo, the inseparable sisters, they're also going to be okay. Bethany had also written some of these heartfelt statements to her roommates, saying, I wish I could tell you I love you one last time. I wish I could give you one last hug. You used to always tell me there was a reason for everything that would happen. But I'm having a really hard time understanding a reason for your untimely passing that night where the 4 of them got murdered in the same house. The tragedy. This story just makes my stomach sick. And if you enjoyed this or got any insight out of this case, I'm going to be covering a lot more true crime cases just like this one. You can find them on my channel of crime entries, and I will see you in the next one.